Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episodes and we going to discuss about net zero challenge for the supply chain management. And we have our Professor Donald, and he is always helpful for World Talent Economy Forums, and that's why he become our advisors, board of advisor for World Talent Economy Forums. And we are trying to develop, not only trying, we already developing our academy as well as our summit and conference. So he will one of the key personnel who will train our students as well as who will example lead our summit and other points. So I want to start these things with Professor Donald, especially how he analyzed this net zero challenge, especially supply chain management area.
Well, supply chain management is it's a complicated issue in the sense that, like, looking at the net zero challenge, and it's important to understand some of the issues with supply chain management, which has to do with international trade. It has to do with the predictions. So what I'm getting at is, like, right now, or last week, our new president, Joe Biden, had a sort of a summit at the White House where they were discussing, where he got people from both political parties to get together to discuss the lack of semiconductors. And right now, there's an issue in the world that we don't have enough semiconductors. And since cars are basically computers these days, all of a sudden people can't build cars, and they can't build computers, obviously, because they need semiconductors. But semiconductors are in everything. My watch, my Fitbit is a computer that's more powerful than the one they had in the first Apollo mission when they first went into space. Much more powerful. And your calculator is more powerful than the supercomputers that they had at the time. So chips are in everything, your calculator. So what happened? Why is that? Why is there a chip shortage? Well, the answer is that they build the chips based on the predicted demand. So since COVID had happened, they had a belief that the demand was going to go down because industry wasn't going to be using it as much. People weren't going to be able to go out and buy cars and blah, blah, blah. They weren't going to need as many chips. So they just didn't make as many. And because of that, they were wrong. And actually, economy limped along pretty well. And now with the stimulus that they're doing in the United States and other countries, there's stimulus in European countries, the economy is taking off. Vaccination is going to make a huge difference. Today I get my second vaccination shot of the Pfizer vaccine. I'm really looking forward to 2 weeks from now being able to go around and do anything I want without worrying about getting COVID. So that's going to happen all over the world. That's another topic, interesting topic. But in any event, so supply chains are chains, and there's links in the chain all the way down. And I think if we had, and maybe we will have, some people that are very, very strong environmentalists and I'm very strong environmentalist too, but I'm research and science based. And one of the things that that some people believe without evidence is that the current way that we're supplying ourselves with goods and services is basically wrong. So what happens is, if I go to the grocery store, I can buy peaches in the winter, and that's because they grow peaches in Chile and they ship them up to Santa Cruz, where I am right now. When I lived in Finland, they can't really grow much vegetables or fruit or anything. There's some fruit, and lots of berries. But so you go to the grocery store, and if you wanted to buy lettuce or broccoli, something like that, some food that you used to eat, they had to bring it up from Portugal and Spain because they just didn't have it. So the whole thing of bringing food from far away to someplace is maybe in some extents it can be a luxury because there's no reason for me to eat peaches in January. I can wait until peach season in June and eat peaches all the way till September, and they come from right near me. Where I'm going with this is that I looked it up. So what people tell you is eat locally. The best thing to do is to not eat food that came from a long way away, but eat food that came locally. But if you go to a farmer's market here in the United States, they have big old trucks. Some of them run diesel, some of them run whatever, just regular gasoline. Everything is these trucks. And every one of these trucks has to go out to every one of the farms and drive to the farmer's market. And there was one calculation, and it's so back of the envelope. In other words, back of the envelope means that when you're talking to somebody, you just grab an envelope and you write your calculations on the envelope, and they're not done by a computer where they're super accurate. But these people actually did use a computer, but but what they found was that the trucks that go to farmers markets actually use more energy than the supply chains, which have gotten so incredibly efficient. Google, Amazon, Walmart, all of these people have ways that they're distributing stuff so that you can get it. I just logged into Google today, and it said, net zero since zero emission, carbon neutral since, what's the date on that? Mm-hmm. Oh, it doesn't say it right now, but it's been decades that they've been carbon neutral for a very long time. I think that's kind of interesting. And all of the big companies are trying to get to carbon neutral. Amazon is, and the way they're doing it, of course, is switching to electric cars, and farmers markets can switch to electric trucks. And so really there's a whole evolution of transportation stuff going to electric, which uses a small fraction as much carbon as gasoline, petroleum. And everywhere in the supply chain, they're coming up now with actually planes that can fly on hydrogen, which is made with electric. So I don't know if you ever did this as a science experiment as a kid, but you can take, just put 2 electrodes in water and run an electric current through it, and it starts bubbling because it breaks up the hydrogen and the oxygen, and they bubble to the surface, and you wind up getting hydrogen and oxygen, which if you light will catch fire. And that's what they're basically doing. And they're using the same kind of power that you can use solar power to do that. And now they're getting airplanes that can fly on hydrogen. And they have ships now that have giant batteries in the bottom. And of course, electric cars are becoming ubiquitous. In California, it's a requirement. In a few years, gasoline cars won't be allowed anymore, only electric cars. And so that's all I can really say. I mean, that's the main thing that I can say about the supply chain, how it works, and how it can get to net zero. So I'd really like to be able to answer questions. Usually,
Yes.
usually there's a whole panel and there's just me today. So
Okay,
it's,
no problem. Basically, like example, for World Talent Economy Forum, actually we want to go for more detailed issues, like step by step. Initially, we do discuss about climate change. Now we want to go for the detailed discussions of the topic. Example, net zeros challenges for supply chain. So that's why we need more expert like you. Like expert can analyze this point in an effective way. But example, what I understand for any of the people who comes and discussing about net zero challenge supply chain, it will be difficult. As you are a researcher, you have a better understanding, better analysis. So this is also our objective, World Talent Economy Forum, that we want to create a real awareness with people. So when you come up with some research and analysis, it will be actually helpful for the mass people for understanding that how actually net zero challenge. I'm sure many people around the world, even in Asia Pacific, they do not know what is net zero challenge. They do not know how actually it helpful for supply chain. So we want to work with the grassroots level, and your knowledge is very helpful. And sometimes many speakers comes, maybe today's session is more complex or more complicated. But I appreciate that we are very happy that we have expert panelists like you who can help us to understand the real things of supply chain and these net zero challenges. But I want to quote one point from this World Economy Forum, actually from their Nigel Topping UNFCCC High Level Climate Action Campaign. They said that supply chain decentralization will be a game changer for the impact of corporate climate action. Addressing scope 3 emissions of fundamental for the companies to realize credible climate change commitments. So what is your views, especially when they discuss among the major findings of the report, they find that many companies can multiply their climate impact by decarbonization supply chain. Second point, eight supply chain account for more than 50% of the global emissions. Net zero supply chain would hardly increase in consumer cost, and decentralization supply chain is hard. So anyway, there are few points World Economy Forums actually trying to analyze this point. What your views, what your analysis on that particular point, or how do you want to analyze means like decentralization?
well, I want to start with something that is a little bit more detailed, which is the whole idea of comparative advantage. And this is an economic idea that has its basis in a guy named Ricardo, who was around about the same time as the American Revolution, 1776. And what he came up with is so right that it's never been like completely blown out of the water. I mean, people are still think it's correct. And what comparative advantage is that some places are going to have an advantage making some things. It won't be the same for everybody. So in a place, if you go down to Louisiana in the United States, and once I hitchhiked from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, which is about, I don't know, a couple of 100 miles. And the whole way I was right next to the Mississippi River. And every other, I mean, there were no houses or people living there. It was just nothing but plant after plant after plant that converted oil into various kinds of things like fertilizer, pesticides. They called it Cancer Alley because there was so much pollution. And the reason that they could do that is because Texas and Louisiana, especially Texas, which is right there, has tons of oil. And they can take the oil and they put it into ships on the Gulf, and then they sail up the Mississippi River, which is a mile wide and can take very large ships. And then they drop off the petroleum there. And so if you wanted to do something like that in Minnesota, or even a place that's got good ports like New York, you'd have to bring the oil a lot farther. and then making the stuff would cost more because there's the expense of transportation costs. Uh, this can apply to ability. So some countries are very, very good at doing certain things. Like right now, many of the textiles that we use are made in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
They so labor costs can be part of it as well. That's an advantage. If you have lower labor costs, if you make the same thing, it's going to be cheaper than if you make it somewhere else. And so they have an advantage compared to someone else. And because of that, trade between different places is a very important and valuable thing to do. And one of the issues is that you have to add to the price of something. So you make some textiles, it costs a certain amount, you move it to the United States. That act of moving it to the United States adds cost. And so when you're comparing textiles to made in the United States to textiles made in Pakistan, and that's where the supply chain issue comes into play. And what the World Economic Forum, not the World Talent Economic Forum, has for their net zero challenge, which you can read on their website, is the idea that as the supply chain is decarbonized, it will create economic advantages and other advantages. So where I'm going with this is that decentralization is difficult because no other place is going to be able, hopefully we're going to stop refining petroleum, stop with petroleum, but I would guess we stop using it as for transportation long before we stop using it for fertilizer, to make fertilizers and pesticides. But the point of the matter, what I'm trying to say is that you could decentralize this. You can't decentralize where the oil comes from, and you can't decentralize where the rare earth minerals come from, and you can't decentralize a lot of different resources that we have. They're in one place, and we can't do anything about it. So that's why the decentralization, that one of the reasons that the decentralization, actually I gave two reasons. The comparative advantage, labor being an example, and then also the fact that resources are in a certain place and they can't be, you can't change that. So another example is agriculture. It's all well and good to say that you should do your agriculture locally, but as I said, Finland, it's completely dark half the year. You can't grow anything. And so if people are going to live there, they have to be able to get their supplies from somewhere else. And that's why decentralization is incredibly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it's valuable is that ultimately solar energy is a lot cheaper than petroleum energy. The consequences of climate change are expensive to organizations as well. There's a document that came out years ago by the US Navy trying to estimate the costs of the damage that climate change was going to cause to the US military. So that's kind of a forward-thinking thing that corporations really wouldn't do usually. But just lower costs for energy are, and then I'm just going to kind of leave it there because I'd rather talk in smaller pieces than just talk. So I'd really like it if you ask me more questions, Sharif.
Thank you. One important thing, like what we are discussing about economical benefit. Can you give me a detail about what type of economical benefit actually through this process, manufacturing industry or the company, those who handle supply chain things, they can get?
Well, part of it isn't just the part of the cost of transportation is waste. So that's kind of the problem with what I was saying about farmers markets. I mean, they're great and everything, but every farmer has to drive their truck to the farmer's market. So if there's 100 people at the farmer's market, 100 trucks have to go to the farmer's market. And that's inefficient. So if you're trying to move something from one place to another, the fewer steps you have to take to make that happen, the more the less it's going to cost, and the more that places that have lower labor costs or resources and things like that have an advantage. So if people can easily sell more things, that's an economic advantage right there. But then lowering the costs, and that's software. That has little to do with, I mean, the software calculates the cost of the energy that it's going to take to go from one place to another. But when Walmart started, they had a place in Bentonville, Arkansas, which was one of the biggest computer software places in the world. And I lived in Arkansas for a year. I know what Arkansas is like, and it is backwards. I mean, we have a term called hillbillies, and so it was kind of a weird place to have one of the biggest software operations in the world. But what they were doing was they were making software so that within Walmart, and Amazon does this now, and lots of people do it now, but they were the pioneers in it. They would keep track of where every single solitary thing they owned was, or that they were going to sell, everything. And they would use computer algorithms to find out that demand was higher in a certain month in one place than it was for another month. So they would bring lots of stuff to the place where the demand was and just basically put it in the storeroom in the back of one of their stores. And so that way they wouldn't have to be making multiple trips. Like when they ran out, then somebody would come, and then, they ran out again and somebody would have to come again. And so being able to use software very much lowers the cost. But so now Amazon has a giant software operation. So for a person that's really interested in logistics right now, it's really basically software. And because of that, we know in great detail where we're using energy and how much energy we're using, or at least Walmart does, and Amazon. Most places don't have the resources to do that. But if that saves them money, then the businesses can sell things at a lower price, which gives more money to everyone else. They can make more money, which is good for their stockholders. So that's the basic reason. That's how it can make more money, because they also do, about carbon offsets. So what happens is people do something that reduces carbon, and because of that, they can use more carbon. And so that's why Google is net zero, because they basically contract someone to plant trees or whatever so that they can be net zero.
Okay, excellent. But one thing, like example, for implementing, what do you think, implementing this kind of net zero strategy for supply chains, industry, for developing nation, as you mentioned about Pakistan, mentioned about India, Bangladesh, even Indonesia, and other country, what do you think? Is it expensive for them, or it's practical? They can implement this kind of strategy and it will be helpful for the country
Well,
like that.
that's a very good question. And It depends, and it depends how you approach it. So that's why it's a good question. In the case that I talked about farmers markets, and just in case people in our audience don't know, a farmers market is a place where they have a local market, and it might be in a parking lot, it might be in a drive-in movie theater that isn't being used during the day, a number of different places, and all the local farmers have the ability to go and set up a booth there where they can sell whatever produce that they happen to be having. And people around here, it's usually organic produce. They're afraid of GMOs, so it's non-GMO, and people can go and buy the produce directly from the farmer. And that's what a farmer's market is. So if you multiply the expense, it's going to get incredibly expensive. In other words, if every single solitary business has to do what Walmart and Amazon has done, it costs a countless amount of money. Plus, who can do it? I mean, who can hire 500 programmers to work round the clock for years to make the software that you want? So one of the ways that people have dealt with that in the United States is they form organizations that are that work together. So you get 10 different shoe stores or 100 shoe stores, and they're independent, but what they do is they arrange it so that they can get this inventory that they need through a single channel. And that single channel, then, if it's 100 different shoe stores, then that single channel has the ability to create the software and create the infrastructure that's necessary to lower emissions and lower costs. So that's something that you can do, and what level you do it at is going to vary from country to country, because in some countries they're very not centralized, and in the United States, the government doesn't have much to do with it at all. But in other countries like Finland, the government provides resources and direction to be able to make things like that happen. And so you look at Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, they all have different systems of the mix between free, and I don't like the word free enterprise, between unregulated commerce and regulated commerce. And so, but that's what you have to do. You have to gang people up, because there's no possible way that almost any company on earth can compete with the logistics of Amazon. They own that space, and there's Walmart, I mean, people that are gigantic can do it, but I think I would guess that Walmart's value is higher than the GDP of Pakistan. I would not be surprised. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
So beside that, yes, no, I understand. Beside that, I have a good interest that what type of technology actually we can utilize for good supply chain management like system. What your advice? And second thing, how we can implement these things.
The first one, I can answer that the important thing to do is to be able to keep track of everything. And we can do that nowadays with big data systems that basically you can gang up lots and lots and lots of computers, have redundancy, so that if something goes wrong on one computer, that information is still scattered across the computers and you can get it back. And that's something you can actually practice doing in your living room. you get a free virtual machine from Oracle and create several computers on your own computer and create a network that acts the way that that the big data systems work. So anyway, and then the second thing is once you have all that data, you have to be able to do something with it, and that's what the field of just they call it big data, but some people also talk about artificial intelligence, deep learning, different kinds of, and these are all strategies, and none of it is really anything close to intelligence. It's just very, very sophisticated ways of doing statistical analysis on the data. And so that can be done with one PC. You can learn how to do it, and you can do it, and you'll have a real big data type network if you have two PCs. So it's not. I mean, it'll be real. If one of the PCs goes down, the data will be on the other PC, so you can keep running. And of course, the more PCs, the better. But that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it is how you keep track of everything. And nowadays, one of the things people are using, and even in the United States, this is beginning. It's not solid, but they're using what are called RFID tags, radio frequency ID, it stands for. And what they are little tiny chips that you can put in anything. In fact, people put them in their cats. They put them in their cats and dogs so that when they get lost, you can scan them and you can find out who the cat or dog belongs to. You can put them in anything, and they're really cheap. And so places like Amazon and Walmart are starting to tag every single solitary thing. So you see those little barcodes. These are like barcodes, but they identify every single solitary item. So when you walk out the door, there's a radio sensor that says, okay, we have one less of whatever it is, because we know. And so what you have to do is you have to create educational technology so people know how to do these things. You have to specifically educate people in computer science and electrical engineering, because even if you buy the stuff from some other country, it could break, and you have to write the computer programs. And all of those analysis programs that I'm talking about that people call artificial intelligence and deep learning and things like that, they're not the final software that's going to be written. People in every country has geniuses and incredible people, but they have to have the ability to be able to analyze these situations, to be able to do it. So I think that the most important thing is to be able to start developing an infrastructure where you can educate computer scientists and electrical engineers, because ultimately that's what's going to have to happen. That's what you're going to need to implement.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have yes, you bring very good point. Computer science engineering as well as electrical engineering. I have one specific things, like how we can develop better education policy, even though we are observing many things happening around us, but what type of policy we should implement in education industry, even though example in supply chains things. What your advice for developing nation?
Well, that's something I think is pretty interesting. If you go and you're really a researcher and a scientist, a social scientist, you would go out. Anyone can do this, but you would take the time to go out and look at what research that people have done about these subjects. So I grew up in a system that was very regimented, and but not anywhere near as regimented as the British system, which was imposed on India and some other places. We would have a math class, and then the next year we'd have algebra 1 and then algebra 2 and so on like that. We'd have English class, we'd have history class, we'd go from class to class all day long, and we had these independent subjects. The question is if there's alternate methods, which there are, which one works better? And how do you find that out? And the answer is you can do double-blind studies, which is the only real way to be sure that there's a difference between two groups. So you teach people one group one way, you teach another group the other way. You have objectives that you can measurable objectives, and you see who does better. So I think all countries, almost all countries, the United States, and I'm sure India and other countries, since it's always been the way that it's been, no one wants to change it. They get furious. We had a guy on the show was all upset about the changes that were taking place in education in the United States, and they're taking place because research shows the way they're doing it is better. People learn better. They get better math scores. They get better scores on all kinds of stuff. It works better. But people strongly resist doing things that work better. So developing nations are going to run into the same thing. However, some of the educational systems in the developing nations are still in the process of growing. And I think a really good analogy is the cell phone, because I went to Finland, I think the first time in 1998. Yeah, I think that's right. And they were already using cell phones everywhere. In the United States, they cost like $400, which was, I guess, now pretty cheap for a cell phone, but relative to what people were paying for regular phones, they were no one, basically, you never saw them. And that happened all over the world. People without countries that didn't have a strong copper-based, wire-based telephone system found it, just skipped it. They leapfrogged over it. They just went straight to cell phones. And I think that that's an advantage that developing countries have as they build out their educational system. They can look around the world and they can find the places that are the most successful and ask the question, how would that work in our country? And I'll give an example is that Singapore has very, very high test scores, and they also have a fairly regimented system. And so it works. In Finland, which also has very, very high test scores, they did away with the separate classes. They don't have history class, nothing. They just mush it all together because people remember things and understand things better if you can apply them to something that's practical in real life. So you can take something like history and add a component to it where people are actually doing math to be able to understand it, and so on like that. They have a system where no class ever goes longer than 45 minutes. And after 45 minutes, you stop and you take a 15-minute break. And the teachers have to take a break too. So everybody's fresh, everybody's memory works really well because they're not getting overloaded. And not only that, they don't have homework. And still they do really, really well. And so why is that? It's because they're constantly looking at the research and refining their teaching methods to be able to use the latest information that we have. I mean, 10 years ago, we knew nothing about the brain. Just 10 years ago. And subsequently, we've invented new instruments to look at it. We've invented new models, new software, and we're starting to understand how we learn at the basis of our brains. So why not apply that to your educational system? It's an advantage that you have, and you really, really should take.
Thank you. When you just discussing about educations and other things besides especially policy and what area we should focus, what do you think? Like example, my personal experience that the developing nations, they can learn more for the developed nations how they can make better ecosystem, especially for different kind of technologies, for modern science, engineering, and technology. So in that situation, what do you think? How developed nations play their roles to create a better ecosystem in between developing nations as well as the developed nations? Are you satisfied with this present collaboration, or you think we can improve a lot?
Well, I definitely think no matter how good somebody collaboration is, it can always improve. There's no point where we're going to be perfect. The world changes around us, so even if it's perfect this year, it might not be perfect next year. We've learned more. The political situation in the world has changed, so that needs to be an ongoing process. And if there is a way to think about your policy in your country that builds in the assumption that you can try things that won't necessarily work and then be able to feel fine about it and change. And again, I go back to Finland. That's what they do. They'll implement a policy and they'll go for a while and they'll say, well, this isn't working. Corporations do this. We do this as individuals, but somehow countries wind up getting, like, ossified is the word. It means they turn into bones. They become rigid. And so I think that you need to look out and look at the countries that are successful and ask the question, what do they do? And try and model them. As far as the interaction goes between education and the greater society, I think the best example is Palo Alto and Silicon Valley. Or, I mean, I think it's a very good example. I don't know every example, so I'm not sure it's the best, but it's a good example. It's a really interesting story. There was a guy named Vannevar Bush, and he was the Secretary of Science during World War II and the years after World War II. In the United States, that was an incredibly fruitful time. I mean, they invented the uses of atomic energy. They invented penicillin. They invented they laid the groundwork so that we went to the moon. I mean, incredible amount of stuff happened. And one of the things that happened is so after World War II was over, Vannevar Bush became an academic and he was teaching at MIT. And one of his students was a guy named Fred Terman. Fred Terman was from Palo Alto. And after he got his Ph.D., Fred Terman went back to Palo Alto and became provost of Stanford. And at the time, Stanford was no big deal. I mean, they called it the farm. It was not a major academic institution like it is now. And he got this idea that, well, I got to say one more thing about Vannevar Bush. If you read the history of the internet, sometimes he's credited as the person who first conceived of the internet. And and what he realized was that all of these different disciplines that he was managing as the head of the science part of the United States were siloed, but yet they all had information that, if possible, they could be learning from each other. He saw that, and he tried to develop a way conceptually that they could do that. So, and basically, he described something that's pretty much like the internet is today. And so, with that belief that he had about the silos and breaking down the silos, Terman came back to Stanford and built business parks in Stanford. Stanford owns a bunch of property. And he said, anyone that's a businessman can go to Stanford for 10 cents on the dollar. So if it costs you $1,000 a year, it would cost $100 a year for a businessman. And one of the things he did is he loaned Hewlett and Packard the money to start their little enterprise in their garage. For the last 10 years, I lived in 200 yards from Hewlett Packard's garage. And there was an article just 2 days ago that I read where they argued that Palo Alto isn't just the center of Silicon Valley, it's the brains of Silicon Valley. And so this feedback loop started happening. Like Stanford's endowment for a while was might be again bigger than Harvard's. And Harvard has been around. It's one of the oldest universities in the United States. It's so many famous people graduated that got very, very rich and can donate money to Harvard. And Stanford is a much, much younger university, but yet it wound up with an endowment. Why is that? Well, when I was working at Stanford, going to school really, I was visiting scholar, they made me sign a thing that said anything I developed with Stanford resources, I had to split with Stanford. So the ownership would be 50-50. And for that, they would patent it and market it. So, I mean, that was a fabulous deal. Well, one of the companies that they helped was Google. So they wound up with a huge interest in Google. And that's why they're one of the richest universities in the world, because they own a chunk of Google. So think about that. Think about what I'm saying as an analogy for what you need to do in developing countries or any country. How do you get to be like Silicon Valley? And one of the main answers is that it's got to do with the exchange of breaking down the silos. So business and academia create a positive feedback loop with each other. So I know a lot. I've met a lot of angel investors and venture capitalists and listened to them talk. And one person said, the perfect person to start a company is a graduate student at Stanford who has an ID, Asian graduate student at Stanford, who has a great idea and is willing to quit their Ph.D. program to start this company. Because Asian parents are so firm about their kids finishing school and getting a good education, they're going to get in big trouble with their parents for doing that. But they're so committed that they're willing to get in that trouble to do it. And he says, when somebody does that, we know they're committed. But think about that. How can you have that? How can you build those kinds of relationships? And that's something that you can do at a policy level. It's something that you can do. And I'll say one more, that when I teach in Finland, my students are from everywhere. And Finland did adopt this as a policy. So they actually allow students from other countries to go there for the same price at the universities that Finnish students pay, which is nothing. They'll even support them. And I'm going to say one thing more about this. I was part of a group, I guess I still am, called the Silicon Valley Network Analysis Project at Stanford. And what the people in the project did is to study the networks in Silicon Valley, the networks of relationships that people had in Silicon Valley. And it's astounding, really, because there's TIE, which, of course, Sharif knows well, which is the biggest biggest networking organization in the world, and it's based in India. And of course, there's a huge number of people in India, but there's also a huge number of people in Silicon Valley. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, networking organization in Silicon Valley. So what you see here is a relationship between India and the United States that doesn't take place at a government level. It takes place at a person-to-person level. But what governments can do is they can allow that, encourage that, and make that happen. And TIE is replicated with every nation in the world. So if somebody wants to have an input in Silicon Valley, to meet somebody, to do something important in Silicon Valley, they can contact somebody from their own country that's in Silicon Valley, and they've got a pathway to be able to get into Silicon Valley and talk to the people that they need. Contrary-wise, if somebody in Silicon Valley has something that they want to sell and they want to sell it into another market, they can go to somebody who's got connections in whatever country it is. And so that's the flow of goods and ideas and all and other things can only happen if you have a diversity of relationships and connections. And that's something countries can very, very, very much make better or worse. So, yeah, I can talk more about it later, but.
Thank you. I'm really interested to learn more about this Stanford ecosystem, like maybe the developing nations, they can learn how to develop a world-class networking communities, and through this process, how they can help each other.
Yeah, that's, I think, a very key. I think one thing, it goes back to what I said at the beginning about comparative advantage. That's one of the reasons that the networking, the connections between countries is incredibly important. Our world has changed a lot to more of an information economy than a goods and services economy. And of course, we need all those kinds of things, but the percentage of the GDP that the goods and services do is shrinking, and the information. And the reason for that is, as I said in the first place, the software and that can change the whole picture of how much. So it's really almost money in your pocket if a company manages to save a whole bunch of money because of what they're doing. So anyway, so the flow of information is less difficult than the flow of goods because we have the internet. One of the things that nations do is they have the ability to screw things up. And the way they screw things up is by restricting the internet. China's doing that. And trade tariffs. And the United States, that former guy, the guy who lost the last election, was really, really big on trade tariffs. And what trade tariffs do ultimately is they raise the price of stuff for consumers and slow the amount of trade. It's kind of just a way of punishing the other country. It doesn't actually create any advantage for anybody. And so what's the opposite of that? And that's what Stanford and Silicon Valley. For instance, I was working at Hewlett-Packard, and I signed a non-disclosure agreement. In fact, everywhere I go, I sign non-disclosure agreements, which means that I promise I won't tell any of their secrets to anyone else. But the funny thing is everyone signs them. But you could go to a pub in Silicon Valley, and all the engineers from the different companies are sharing their woes and sharing things that they learned and sharing things that they understood. And no one says a thing about it. And Silicon Valley's always been that way. And after I'd been at Hewlett Packard for a while, one of the managers told me, they said, if you tell anybody anything that can affect the financial view of Silicon Valley, you're out of here. But technical stuff we don't care about. I was teaching a class on Hewlett Packard's operating systems internals, the secret of how their operating system worked. And somebody said, well, how does Sun Microsystems do this particular thing? And I said, well, I don't really know. And one of the guys in the class said, well, I'll ask my wife. She works in the kernel group at Sun. So I think governments can do it to a certain point, but it's also got to do with culture. And sometimes some cultures, people just don't believe in sharing. And I mean, the United States has lots of cultures, and there's cultures like that, but that's not the way Silicon Valley worked. Silicon Valley works, you go and meet somebody at a networking event, and after they've asked your name and where you work and the normal things that they ask you, they say, well, how can I help you? What can I do to help you? So I'd love everyone's ideas about how to make that happen, but that's the goal you have to aim for.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure that the audience also learned from you. And my friend from Sri Lanka, he also said, sir, very much thankful. Still, you giving fulfilled support to us through World Talent Economy Forum. Respect. So I'm sure that different people from different countries, they are really love your contributions for World Talent Economy Forums. So that is the way that we want to develop a better ecosystem. What you learn in Silicon Valley, what you learn in Stanford University, maybe this is very helpful for my friends in Sri Lanka or in Bangladesh or in Malaysia, or in Singapore. They need your guidelines, they need your help. So that is the way actually World Talent Economy Forum we are growing. And today's topic is very special topic, and you are very special for World Talent Economy Forum with your special contributions. And inshallah, in between soon we are starting our academy, our research, and our like summit and this kind of things. So hopefully we will get more of your support and we will grow together. And by this way, maybe you can develop more sustainable ecosystems and I think effective youth community who will develop their own nations. And by this way, we can change the world. So thank you for your contributions. And what is your concluding remarks for today?
I think that ultimately the kind of fuel for what we're trying to do to reduce emissions and try and create a sustainable world comes from each of us inside and the people that we're connected with. In the United States, and all over the world, there's a lot of pressure on corporations and governments to start dealing with the problems that we have of global warming and the climate crisis that we're having right now. And so just kind of, I read an article in Science a couple of weeks ago that said that by just talking to people and telling people what you know and encouraging people to learn more about the climate crisis and the alternatives, the things that I was talking about better ways, better logistics, by understanding the graphs basically of the paths of how everything's flowing and optimizing those paths so those paths become they have less impact on the environment. And of course, the move to electric and things like that are all things that you can pressure your governments and your friends to be able to do. And so my concluding remark is to just, Google is your friend. Wikipedia can get you started on understanding almost anything. Go to the bottom where it has the references and read those. Don't trust that the person that wrote it actually completely understood what they were writing, but they always give references, and you can go to the original sources. So, and you personally, the whole STEM thing, science, technology, engineering, and math, is going to be key to all of this stuff. But I also want to recommend that you don't stop there, because one of the biggest problems we have in the United States is lack of empathy in our leaders. They just simply don't care about other people. They only care about themselves. And studies have shown that if you read novels, read science fiction, read whatever you think is fun, read good novels, read the novels by the people in your country that are most admired. And when you do, it changes you so that you become more empathetic. And if we're going to make a better world, we have to not just do it for ourselves. We also have to be open to be able to start doing it for other people. And that goes to the core of what I was talking about Silicon Valley, which is the first thing people say to you is, how can I help you? And I think that's the key to all of this. Look around the world around you and ask the question, how can I help you? And that's what I'd recommend. That's my closing remark.
Thank you, sir, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Tomorrow we have very important sessions for manufacturing industries, because Asia Pacific, there are many manufacturing industries, especially China, even in Malaysia we have. So hopefully we will learn many interesting things. We are inviting many interesting guests from around the world. So hopefully Professor Donald also join with us and contribute through his knowledge. And hopefully soon we will arrange our summit. From May 1 and 2, we have our own summit, Futuristic Leadership Summit. So we are bringing 300 different corporations from around the world. And beside that, World Talent Economy Forum, we are moving with our fundraising initiative, as well as membership collections, as well as because we have some big plan. Now we need the support. And because if we can provide a professional support to our mentors also can do a lot of things for us, lot of things for the communities. So this is the way we have to help each others. We have to value their time and everything. So thank you, Professor Donald, for your long time support. And hopefully by this way, we will grow a new generation, which will be helpful for every nation. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's always an honor to be on your show.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.